Welcome back to the dojo, guys. So, what we're going to do today is I think we're going to go over some lighting scenarios so that you guys are using lighting properly and sampling properly and doing everything sort of right from the ground up. I've noticed over the years that students kind of get their lighting done halfway if they're using the Arnold Render Engine. In other words, some of the settings aren't correct and proper, and you guys are struggling with the way it looks, and you're having to put kludges on top of it in post-production to make it look correct. Now, we're always going to do some post-production correction, and I would like to make sure that that's minimized by setting everything up correctly sort of the first time. So what I'll do is I'll open up a scene that I've been working on, probably been using it for a tutorial, and I think Fractal Relic, just this one right here, will work for us. As I spoke about in a previous tutorial, I've been treating the graph editor and the resulting artifacts from it as something that I was kind of building a, how would you call it? An installation. I started imagining them as sculptures and decided to start modeling and rendering them that way. I'm going to change this and open a different one actually. There we go. The reason I opened this one is this one's more finalized. So I started imagining this Bifrost graph network here as suspended from these steel cables, as you would see sort of in a gallery space. And so I created the graph network, of course. Shaded it very, very simply. Pardon, I've got a frog in my throat. Every time I do a tutorial, it seems like I get a little frog in my throat. But I went in and made these wire clamps based on some wire clamps that I have in my studio, suspending some artwork. You can see it's a nut, a screw, what's called a tackle block, and the cable kind of running through it. Very simple, and it does the job. I also lit it. Let's go back to our normal render view here. I also lit it with both a soft area light, which I think we're going to lift up here just a bit like so, and a sky dome light with a very low exposure just to give us some color variation in the fill shadow areas. Now, there are many ways to light things. One of the things I want to talk about is when we're lighting something, especially if we're using a rational light, and by rational light I mean, let's go to our rendering shelf here, whether we're using a point light, a spotlight, or an area light. These are known as rational lights, parametric lights. I need to set things up in a certain way, so we're just going to go over this again to make sure that this is concretized in you guys' minds and that you really do understand the parameters that we're working with. First and foremost, intensity always stays at 1. Always, forever, for no other reason. We never change it. The intensity of the light will always stay at 1. Well, Jamie, why do they have a slider here that allows you to change it from anything but 1? Well, that harkens back to Maya before Arnold, and that's how we controlled our lights way back then in the Stone Ages. However, now we have a much more sophisticated render engine, and we're going to control these lights in a different way. The only two things that I ever change in here is, one, the decay rate must always be set to quadratic. Always. Always set to quadratic. Quadratic decay obeys the inverse square law, which is how physical light behaves, meaning how light falls off in intensity, or lux, L-U-X, over distance. Once I've done that, the only other thing I might change in this is the color of the light, and that's only if I'm going for something very creative, and we'll look at that perhaps in a little bit. Next, under the Arnold tab, this is where I'm going to set everything up. Now, my exposure is set to 15. Generally, I tell you guys to start setting your exposures around 12 and then kind of move on from there. I will set the color temperature of the light here, whether I want to use a cool light or a warm light. Remember, the higher the color temperature, 6,500 degrees Kelvin, is considered daylight, clean, high noon daylight. If I want to go with a more sunsetty color, I would lower that Kelvin temperature. And if I wanted to cool it off even more, I can go into some unrealistic temperatures up here, which you can see make the light considerably blue. However, those aren't realistic values, and generally I will not travel above 6500. If I did want the light to turn blue, I would then come up here, and this is what I would change. Again, intensity will always stay at 1. Next, I need to set my light samples, minimum of 3. I usually set them to about 4. This allows our light to clean up its shadow and light work without having to increase those render samples that we saw in previous tutorials. Next thing I'm going to do is just sort of decide, do I want this light to be soft? Do I want it to be... You can play around with a lot of these values. You don't need to play with volume samples unless you have a volume, and none of you guys will. So let's do a quick render and just take a look at what we've got, and then we'll look at the parameters for setting up a Skydome light as well, because that's something you guys I think need to know, which will certainly be helpful for everything you're going to do. In fact, we'll probably delete it and make a new one just so you can see how it's done. So let's go and open our Arnold render view. This is from a previous tutorial. Hopefully you guys remember that. Now remember, I've got my render set to 2K, square 2K by 2K, and there you can see I've done, well, to my eye at least, I've done a fairly making this look like a sculptural installation hung in a gallery space. Now I'm going to tweak these shaders a little more. I prefer them to be much more metallic, and that wire right there looks a little hinky. So we're going to sort that out real quick before I go on, because my OCD will not allow this. So let's grab just those verts right there, and I'm simply going to kind of move that over a little bit, maybe about right there. And then, like I said, we're going to tweak this shader. They both have the same shader. Let's rename it. I just applied those, call them wires. That's fine. I'm going to push the metalness up. Specular roughness is pretty good. Let's go about just under 0.2. Now let's take a look and see how that is coming out for us. So quick re-render. When I'm just working with a section, I'll use my little sectional icon so that I can just focus on that one area. Alright, that's a little bit better. Still not quite getting me where I want to go. I think we're going to drop this base color to black, because shiny chrome metal is actually gets its color from the environment, so it doesn't actually really have much of a color. It's better, and I'll tweak that a little more as we go along. It's not going to be as specular or as shiny simply because we're using soft area lights, and that is to be expected, and that's okay. So if we look at that render one more time, we'll see that we've got our area light hitting us from this side, and then we've got our Skydome light set to the low exposure, bringing in some color variation and a little bit of fill to this side. Now if I wanted to, I could delete this Skydome light. We're just going to hit Control H to hide it for now, so I don't delete all of it. And then let's take a look at the render without the Skydome light and just the area light. Now we're getting a much different render, as you can see. And so there are a few things I can do here. One, I may grab this area light. I can grab it here in the outliner or right here in the viewport. And I think I'll change this to about 4,000 Kelvin to warm that light up. And then I'll also create a fill light. And this is just a studio lighting technique known as butterfly lighting, where I will, there we go, zoom out. I'm just going to duplicate this light, Control D. And if I hit T on my keyboard, it pulls up the manipulator for the light, and I can kind of position it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go at a traditional butterfly lighting setup. One light at 90 degrees, the other light at about 45 degrees. Now this light will be set to a slightly lower exposure. Let's go to about 14. And don't worry, we can go back and adjust both lighting exposures to make them look the way we want. And I'll probably change the color temperature of this one up to something a bit cooler, like 5,000 degrees Kelvin. And for me, that's just to create a bit of interest. That's not quite how I would light it in a gallery space. Get that out of our view. However, it's how I'd like to light it here. I'm also going to maybe drop this one down. So again, I'm in a traditional photo studio butterfly lighting scenario. One light kind of up and at 45, and another light off to the side, off at 90 degrees and down at 90 degrees. So let's take a look and see what that does for us. Alright, that's starting to look a little better. This is just too warm for my taste, however, so let's go and clean these lighting temperatures up. Let's put this back. Let's go around 5,500 Kelvin. And for our fill light, generally, actually, you know what, I'm going to reverse these. For my key light, I usually put my key light as my most neutral light. You don't have to do that. You can change anything you want. And I'll set my fill light as my warmest light. It seems to just work a bit better that way. So about 4,500 degrees Kelvin. I think for our key light here, which means our main light, I'll also increase the exposure to about 16.5. Let's see if that's a little bit too much. Should be okay. We'll see. And now we'll render again. Alright, that's starting to be a little more interesting. You can see this fill light is warming this area up. Might be a little too much for me. So I'm going to adjust that. Let's take a snapshot so we can see a before and after. I'm going to adjust it, and I'm going to move the light just a wee bit out. Let's move it out this way just a little bit. I'm going to go away from a traditional butterfly pattern and go for a little more fill right here. I'm also going to scale it up a bit. The scale of your light does impact how it renders. Larger lights are softer, smaller lights tend to be sharper. That's starting to look better to me. So I've got what we call a key light, our main light, and then a fill light here. That's adding a little visual interest by changing that color temperature up. And you can see our before and after on that. Just moving that light a bit and adjusting those exposures slightly. You can also see that the light here is kind of appearing on the background of our studio, sort of, whilst realistic, I don't quite want that. So I think I'm going to choose that background plane here. Under our AI standard material, I'm going to push its roughness up to something that a wall would have. You know, wall would have a little bit of gloss, but not that much. And there we go. I'll probably even push that up a little bit whiter. There we go. So hopefully this makes sense to you guys. Now let's look at one more lighting scenario. I'm actually going to adjust just so you guys can see how easy this is to iterate and to really have fun with. Let's open our Bifrost graph editor and let's look at the current graph. And this is my strands around strands graph that I've created. We're going to adjust this a bit. We're going to change the number of children to 12. I'm going to change twists ratio to about 5. I'm doing some kind of random stuff here. Let's go in and in our vector field scope, let's adjust this length flow line per second. We're going to increase a bit, and samples I think will increase to about, let's say 4. Remember, all of these are going to affect the actual physical manifestation of this. And then I can go to my scale field and play with that a little bit. Let's go maybe just 25, 25, 25. That's going to be a very, well, not horribly different, but quite a different looking render than our previous one. And then we're going to change the lighting scenario as well. I will save a snapshot, render it out, and now we've got a very different sculpture hanging in space just by adjusting those values. Now what I'm going to do just so you can see, is we're going to create a new Skydome light, and we're going to use an HDRI material to help fill that in. And this is, we already have one, I know, but this is so we can walk through it again and so that you guys can understand how we set this lighting up. So one, I do want to go and get an HDRI file to plug in for my HDRI light. And I have a bunch of those on my Maya drive here under my HDRI folder. And we're just going to do this abandoned tile room 4K. Next, after I've pulled that file in, I need to make certain to open color balance and turn on alpha is luminance. If I don't do that, it won't work properly as an HDRI light. And I generally also come down here under, well, I'll show you after. My next step before I set anything in here is I always do, just so I don't forget, I turn the visibility to camera down to 0. And under viewport, I'll often turn the sky radius down to 0, just so I don't have to see the Skydome light. It can become visually distracting. Now, that's a choice. You don't have to do that. That's something I do just so that it's not appearing in my viewport and I'm not confused by it. It doesn't get visually in the way of anything else that's happening in here. Let's adjust our composition a bit. We're going to tighten that up to create a nicer figure-ground relationship and maybe give it a little bit of a turn like that. Maybe a little down. That's good right there. Alright, so next for our Skydome light, because my HDRI file that I've plugged into my color slot is a 4K file, I am going to set the resolution here to 4096. That's 4K. That's the size of the file. Next, I'll make certain to set my exposure. Right now at 0, we're pretty good. We can tweak it up or down if we need to. And I'll push my samples to a minimum of 3. I generally push them to 4. Now that's it for now. One of the things I can do is disable my area lights if I want, but let's see how this looks with the area lights and the Skydome light. It'll probably be a little bit overlit, and then we'll just readjust the exposure on the Skydome light. Yeah, that is way overlit. So with our render active here in our screen, let's go and adjust the exposure of our Skydome light down. I just want it to contribute a little bit of visual interest in those fill areas, pretty much like what we've got. We're pretty good at about 2.5, negative 2.5. Let's see how that looks. Give her a second, maybe about negative 2.3. And let's go to render. Whoop, Maya's thinking. Bumped up a little bit. I think about negative 2.220. Maya's rendering at the same time, so negative 2.2 looks pretty good to me. So now I've combined two area lights as if I would set them up in a studio or in a gallery to light this piece. And I also brought in a Skydome light with an HDRI file mapped to it to create a much more interesting visual lighting scenario. We've got some beautiful shadows with cast color. Our highlights look great. Nothing's blown out. And if I needed to, I could tweak this a little bit. And there's really no shader more complex than an AI standard surface material set to white with a high roughness, so that this is kind of like a bisque fired plaster. That's how I was imagining it. So that is lighting. That's setting up lights. Hopefully this is helpful to you. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments, let me know in the comments and feedback. Remember to hit that like and subscribe button. Hopefully this is helpful to you guys. And again, don't hesitate if something is a little bit hard to understand to ask me to clarify it. All right, have a good one.